Gosh. It's nice to see so many people. Actually, it's nice to see some familiar names too, actually.
The people.
Right, well, just while the last few people are connecting through, and I'm sure we may get a few late arrivals, I'll just introduce our speaker. Well, I'll say a couple of words and then introduce our speaker. Just to begin with, thank you very much for turning up and joining us, and welcome to the Society for Church Archaeology's online lectures. We had a lecture few months ago now, I think by Carenza Lewis, which proved very popular. So we've decided to roll out a program of lectures. So this is the first. And just as a matter of a couple of bits of housekeeping, if you can make sure your microphones are turned off, probably for your benefit as well as ours sometimes. And again, we'll be taking questions. So if you put questions into the chat box rather than asking them, so you can ask questions as we go along. And then at the end, Rob will be sort of sorting those out and asking them to our speaker. I'd like to give a few quick thanks before we start. Well, first to Rob, who I've just named, who is our new publicity officer, who's set this all up, and we're very grateful for that. And also mainly to all of you for joining us, but of course to our guest speaker tonight, who is David Petts, Dr. David Petts, who is a senior lecturer at the University of Durham. And he's probably well known to you if you follow archaeology. He's been working on the development of Christianity for quite a few years. I won't say how many. And he's excavated at a number of key sites, including the Roman fort at Binchester. But tonight he's going to be talking about his work at Lindisfarne. And I won't say any more about that because that's why we're here to talk. So we're very grateful for him to be giving us this little unique insight into what's really a very exciting site, I think. And the title of his talk, if I haven't got it wrong, is The Early Medieval Monastery at Lindisfarne. So take it away, David.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to be here. We were just discussing before you all arrived how in the past we've both spent lots of time talking to small groups of people in parish halls down rainy country lanes. So it's quite nice to be able to talk to audiences and free figures from the comfort of my own house. So that's been very nice. So hopefully you can all see my screen. So if someone can give me a thumbs up or a wave or a nod, excellent. Right, so the next thing is to actually start the PowerPoint. Okay, right, so there we are. So what I want to do this evening is talk a little bit about the archaeological work which I've been doing on the Holy Island of Lindisfarne along with my collaborators, Dig Ventures. We've been exploring the archaeology of Lindisfarne we've just finished, actually we just managed to squeeze in a field season last year. We were lucky, we were about one of the few teams who were able to get out and do some work. So that was our 5th season. So in addition to a little bit of kind of, evaluation work beforehand, we've been in the field on and off for nearly 7 years now. And I want to focus in particularly on the work we've done. Lindisfarne's obviously an incredibly important monastic site. There's a huge amount of potential there. There has been other archaeology there, but I'm going to focus in on what we've been doing and what I think it can tell us about understanding the Anglo-Saxon monastery at the site. So these are all the dates you're going to get this evening. I'm an archaeologist, so I'm not an historian, so I don't deal with individual years on the whole. I tend to deal with larger watches of time. But it's useful to give you a little bit of a sense of the historic background to the Anglo-Saxon monastery, the early medieval monastery. Lindisfarne is founded in AD 635. It's founded by King Oswald of Northumbria and a monk named Aidan. Oswald had until very recently had been in exile in Western Scotland. He was the nephew of the powerful Northumbrian King Edwin, and basically being an heir to an Anglo-Saxon kingdom is basically very bad for your health because you're seen as a rival and tend to be picked off. So he was in safe place in exile in Western Scotland, and when Edwin was finally defeated in battle and killed, Oswald was able to come in fairly quickly and assume power. Whilst he'd been in Scotland, he had converted to Christianity, probably at Iona, but certainly converted into the Irish tradition of Christianity, and that's quite important. We'll come to that later on. So when he comes back to Northumbria, he comes with Aidan, a monk from Iona, and they establish a monastery on the Isle of Lindisfarne. And I think one of the key things I'm keen to make clear is that it's very easy to think of Lindisfarne as being somewhere which is remote and austere and distant, but actually it's only a hop and a jump over the water to Bamborough, which was a major Northumbrian palace site, and of course sitting on those sea lanes which were used for communication in the early medieval period. It was actually quite a central location. Everything goes swimmingly. We have Lindisfarne bobs along quite nicely for about 30 years, and during that period it is, for all intents and purposes, a daughter house of Iona. But the situation changes in 664. As I said, Oswald had converted to the Irish tradition of Christianity, but the trouble is Edwin, his predecessor, had been converted to Christianity in a different tradition, in a Roman Frankish tradition, and by the time we get to 664, the king, who by that point is Oswy, his wife is also following the Roman Frankish tradition, whereas Oswy's following the Irish tradition. And there's various distinctions between the two traditions of Christianity, but in practical terms, one of the differences is the calculation of Easter. So we have Oswy feasting at the end of Easter while his wife is still fasting, which is not a recipe for domestic harmony. But it's a bigger issue. I think it's about politics. It's about whether Northumbria wanted to face towards the other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, face towards the Franks and Rome, or whether it wanted to face north towards the world of the Picts and the British of Strathclyde and the Irish kingdom in Western Scotland. So there's a big synod which is held, a church meeting, and Coleman, who's abbot of Lindisfarne, speaks for the Irish tradition, but he is defeated. And in 664, the Northumbrian church turns towards the Frankish Roman tradition of Christianity. Coleman goes back to Lindisfarne. He and many of the other monks who don't want to adhere to that decision, they leave, they head back to Iona before heading over to Western Ireland. So this is a really key point in the story of Lindisfarne. It's when it stops becoming an Irish monastery and becomes a Roman Frankish monastery in many ways. A new figure comes onto the scene at this point. This is Cuthbert. Cuthbert was a nobleman originally from the Scottish borders, becomes a monk, gets a reputation for being both a safe pair of hands and a reputation for sanctity. He becomes abbot at Lindisfarne. He ends his days as a hermit on the island of Innerfarne, which is just across the water from Lindisfarne, and then he does the best possible thing for Lindisfarne, and that's he dies, because that gives the monks of Lindisfarne a saint. Normally, an Anglo-Saxon monastery, or an early medieval monastery more generally, the key figure would be the founding saint. So normally it would have been Aidan who would have been the key figure for Lindisfarne. But because of this kind of readjustment towards the Roman tradition of Christianity, Aidan was tainted by association with the Irish tradition. So Cuthbert comes in and he's a safe pair, he's a clean pair of hands, he's not tainted with the Irish tradition. So he becomes the new figurehead for the monastery. He dies on Innerfarne. He's brought back to the mainland of Lindisfarne, where he's buried and then exhumed and found to be miraculously incorrupt. And that's the point where his body is taken out of the ground and raised above the ground. And that, for all intents and purposes, is the point at which Cuthbert becomes a saint. There's no paperwork involved, as it were. It's becoming a saint by acclamation. And this marks the beginning beginning of probably the most vital period of Lindisfarne's existence. This is when it achieves its greatest reputation. In practical terms, Cuthbert becomes a draw for pilgrimage, and pilgrims bring gifts of money. They also result in gifts of land. So Lindisfarne ends up holding a huge amount of land in northern England and southern Scotland. It's about this period that the Lindisfarne Gospels are seemingly created as well, probably as part of the programme of saint making, of a promotion of the cult of Cuthbert at this time. Again, we have a fairly peaceful 100 years, then the first Viking attack in 793. This is one of the things Lindisfarne's most famous for. It's the first attack in northern England, but it doesn't deal a death blow. It's just the first of many. The tempo of attacks kind of drops off a little bit in the early 9th century, then picks up again. And then, according to the traditional stories, the monks leave Lindisfarne in 875 with the relics of Cuthbert and the other saints and other bits and pieces. They go to various sites in northern England. They go down to Ripon, they go down to Crake in North Yorkshire, they go to Norham, just inland up the Tweed, before finally ending up in Durham. And the monastery and the ecclesiastical site at Durham, which is now Durham Cathedral, was basically the final resting place of the community of St. Cuthbert, and that's why Cuthbert's relics are there. And then we reach kind of full circle after the Norman conquest, when the monks from Durham go back to Lindisfarne and refound a more traditionally Norman-style monastic site on the island. And those are the ruins you see today. So that's the basic historical outline. What about the archaeology? I think one of the first things to say is that Lindisfarne's seen remarkably little archaeology compared with other key early medieval monastic sites. Iona, for example, has been cut to ribbons by archaeologists, to be brutal. Sites like Monk Wearmouth and Jarrow have both seen extensive excavations. Lindisfarne, for various reasons, had actually seen remarkably little extended fieldwork, particularly in recent years. And particularly focusing in on the monastic enclosure. There's been, alongside the work we've been doing, there's also been a lot of work done as part of the community project funded by the lottery. I'm not going to talk about their results today. I'm going to focus on our stuff. So that's a kind of little bit of context. Just this slide is really just a quick reminder, because I'd imagine by the fact that you're all here, you have some understanding of where Lindisfarne is. We're up on the very far northeast of North Northumberland. We're about 15 miles south of the Tweed, which is now the Scottish border. But I think one of the key things to remember is in this period, there is no such thing as the Anglo-Scottish border. Northumbria goes up to the Firth of Forth, it extends west over to the Irish Sea. And we need to think of Northumbria not as a northern English kingdom, but as a central British kingdom. It's a kingdom that looks up to the Picts and the Scots and the Brits in Strathclyde as much as it looks southwards to places like Mercia. It's bang in the centre of the island of Britain. So the island itself, as you can see, is just off about kind of 10 miles north of Bamborough. And it's just, in terms of a shape, it's a long comma-shaped island. Tidally accessed. It was tidally accessed in the early medieval period. We know that. Bede writes about that, and it's still tidally accessed today. When the tide goes down, you can come on by the causeway. When the tide goes up, the island's isolated. And our excavations, the site of the early monastery and the later monastery, are basically focused on an area just to the south of the main village on the island, and the village lies in the southwest corner, and you can see our trenches highlighted in red there. It's worth taking a step back and thinking a little bit about how the landscape of the island has changed over the period since the time of Cuthbert. One thing which hasn't changed radically is the sea level itself. The sea level seems to be pretty much the same as it was back then, but there have been other changes. We certainly know that the access routes to the island have changed. Now you come on to the island via a a proper road over from the west of the island, which takes you to the far west of the island, and then runs along the southern side of the Snook down to the village. And that was kind of formalised in the 1950s. And there are some foot routes you can take across the sands. But if we go back into the 18th century and look at maps from then, it's clear that there is multiple routes that could be taken across those sands, and those have largely disappeared now. But I think the most important route originally was actually this one here in the middle. You can see shown on Armstrong's map from 1769, and that runs from the village and it comes here at Fenham. And Fenham, we know, was the estate centre for the big group of estates on the mainland known as Islandshire, owned by the community, and it's where their big granary was on the mainland. And in terms of how it fits into the island, you can see from Armstrong's map that actually it was just an extension of the main street in Lindisfarne, in Holy Island Village, which suggests to me is actually that probably was the original main, most important route onto the main. That seems to have disappeared some point in the 19th century. Other changes we've got, the sand dunes. A lot of people will be familiar with the Northumbrian coast, will know that the sand dunes of Bamborough and Lindisfarne and that part of the coastline really could give it character today. But also we know that from various bits of geomorphological work and landscape work that these sand dunes probably date to the late medieval or early post-medieval period. They're a product of the stormy conditions of the Little Ice Age. And indeed, on Lindisfarne, if you've got very good eyesight, you can actually see there's ridge and furrow, medieval ridge and furrow on the very north of the island, and in places that is overlain by sand dunes. And the same goes to the big Anglo-Saxon cemetery at Bamborough, which is overlain by the sand dunes. So these are a later feature. The other key area where the landscape has changed is around the village and the harbour itself. As I said, the sea level itself hasn't changed. Sea level's been pretty consistent. But if you look at this map on the left, this Google Earth image on the left, you can see there's this large bright green area behind the current harbour, and that's a very low-lying, very poorly drained area, and which is on a different level from the village itself. And again, if you go back and look at the historic maps, we can see that actually there used to be a large lagoon behind the shingle spit that formed the harbour, and that would have meant that the island and the monasteries would have been on much more of a pronounced headland than they are today. So that's another way in which the topography of the islands perhaps changed a little. Now, we can be fairly confident that the Anglo-Saxon monastery was situated in and around the ruins of the later priory and the village itself. It's worth saying that early medieval monasteries could be quite substantial, whereas the later medieval monastery at Lindisfarne is pretty compact. It's fairly small as later medieval monastic sites go. But Lindisfarne was, in the early medieval period, was hugely important. If you compare it with Iona, which is, I think, is a good comparison site, then the footprint of the Anglo-Saxon monastery on Lindisfarne probably extends under all of the village. And really from the south coast, from where the hoof is, all the way to the northern side of the village. So it would have been very substantial. So that's something to remember, is we're only excavating, we're only seeing tiny keyholes of a much bigger site. Now, we know, we've always been fairly sure that the Anglo-Saxon monastery was beneath or around that area for a number of reasons. First of all, Anglo-Saxon sculpture. Fragments of Anglo-Saxon sculpture have long been found on Lindisfarne, basically from the site of the priory, the later priory, and from grave digging in the parish church. So that's, these are big bits of stone, they don't move very far, so we've been fairly good evidence that that was where certainly the ecclesiastical core of the early medieval monastery was. Also, we've got some other more circumstantial evidence. This is a plan of the monastery, of the later priory. There's a priory church, it's like a little kind of miniature Durham cathedral. But you can see here's the parish church just due west of it, and it's slightly off, but they're more or less on a linear alignment. And that kind of alignment of churches is very typical of Anglo-Saxon church planning. We find that kind of thing down in that kind of arrangement in places like Canterbury, and that reflects the influence of Frankish church layouts as well. Now, obviously, there's no Anglo-Saxon standing fabric in the Priory Church, but when the site was cleared in the late 19th century, traces of an earlier stone building were apparently found, though the recording was not good. Also, there are hints of Anglo-Saxon fabric in the parish church, though the bulk of the parish church is later. But that's circumstantial evidence. All points to the long-term continuity of the ecclesiastical core at the site. But what about our work? Well, as I said, there's not been an awful lot of work done on the ecclesiastical core at Lindisfarne. So one of the things we did is, before we opened up our trenches, as with any archaeological project, we went through what we call an evaluation stage. So rather than putting all our eggs in one basket and opening up one big trench and just risking where we put it, we did a bit of kind of due diligence, essentially. So we did a large-scale geophysical survey. What you can see here is just a tiny bit of it. We extended it to the north of the village as well, and it came clear that there's a lot of activity in the green areas surrounding the village. You can see there's various to the west of the village. There's various paddocks and lots of stuff going on. It's a bit tricky to pull out precisely what it is. And we got quite excited by this line here, because one of the things an early medieval monastery ought to have is big boundary features, and that kind of line there does seem to follow on that road line there, and potentially was a kind of a boundary cutting off the headland. We also found lots of features in this field here to the east of the later priory. Now, one interesting thing is that there's a second cloister to the monastery, which is quite unusual. This is for the later monastery, the later priory, which is fantastic, really, really cool, very interesting, but not what we were after. We put some evaluation trenches, which are in blue, in this field too, just to try and sample what was there. Now, in our evaluation trench to the west of the village, we didn't hit a big early medieval boundary, so we didn't find what we hoped we'd find. Instead, we found lots of later medieval occupation. It came clear quite rapidly, but the medieval village actually extended up to the shoreline, and it had contracted probably about the same point the later priory had been dissolved. Whether there's a connection there, we don't know. It may be that road line does preserve an earlier medieval boundary, but we didn't find proof of it in our fairly brief excavation on that site. We did, however, find a fragment of Anglo-Saxon comb, which does suggest that there's maybe earlier medieval stuff surviving underneath there. In our two trenches over here, our two little blue trenches, we did find the good stuff. We did find what we were after. They're only kind of quite limited trenches, because they're these small evaluation trenches. We found an Anglo-Saxon coin in the northern one. And in this trench here, we found lots and lots of human bone and a fragment of Anglo-Saxon sculpture. And I'll show you those in a minute. So that's where we decided to focus our excavations in the following 5 years. So our what looks like a big single trench, when you look at the little red box on the previous slide, is actually two trenches. Normally we'd open it up as one big area, but we have the slight disadvantage. We've got a very high voltage cable running straight through the area, which keeps the navigation lights on up on the rocky crag to the south of the island. So we decided not to try and put a mattock through that. So we've got two parts of the trench. We've got an eastern and a western part. What we're looking at here is the eastern part of our trench, with north to the right, and immediately you can see we've got lots of human burials popping out. An incredibly dense concentration of human remains. You can see the obvious extended skeletons here, but if you follow my cursor, there's skull, 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 all the way across, and you can see there's just bits of human bone everywhere, which is really, really densely packed burials, lots of intercutting, and we're being fairly circumspect about how many we're actually removing, because it's quite time consuming, quite expensive. So we're only sampling those human remains at the moment, but you can see we've clearly hit a burial site, and We had carbon-14 dates done, and this burial site seems to have burials from the 8th, 9th century, and also some of the latest ones are probably 11th, early 12th century. So it's a long-lived cemetery area. We have, and you can see some of the most of the burials are just west-east lines with no obvious grave cuts. In fact, we've barely seen a single clear grave cut while we've been there. There's so much intercutting. We can also see we've got some with hints of stone linings. We've got at least one here with a big capstone covers. We also have this very, very odd big bit of wall, which for a long time we thought was quite late. And we kind of ignored it because we thought it's something very, very late. In our latest season, we've realised it's actually probably broadly early medieval date. And to be honest, it's a bit of a mystery at the moment. As you can see, there's not much of it. It did continue a little bit to the north, but not very far. But that's one of our things we're trying to better understand at the moment. Here you get a sense of the range of burials we've got, and there's some key things to take home here. First of all, we've got lots of adults. It's not surprising. We've got men and we've got women. So it's clearly not a male monastic cemetery. We've also got children. Now, some of the children are aged about 7, which they could be monks. You could be a monk at 7. Bede becomes a monk at 7. 7 was the age where often people would be fostered or adopted or become monks. But we've also got younger children as well, including at least 2 mother-baby pairs. So what we've got is a cemetery which has old, young, and everything in between. So it's clearly a what we might call it a secular cemetery rather than a monastic cemetery. That's not surprised really, because we know from Bede he talks about the cemetery of the brothers, which implies there's a cemetery where the monks were buried, and big monastic sites like this, one would expect to have multiple cemeteries and multiple churches. We find exactly the same somewhere like Iona. You can see the bodies are extended to the west feet to the east. No sign of coffins, not a single coffin stain or iron nail have we found. Generally, they seem to be in shrouds. They're often quite kind of hunched up, and we found thousands of quartz pebbles. The quartz pebbles, that's a tradition which is found in early Christian sites in northern Britain, Scotland, and Ireland. We've been poking around the island itself, and we can't find anywhere where they could have come from on the island. So the quartz pebbles are probably brought from somewhere else, which is actually quite important. But we've got a really interesting mix of material here. We're doing lots of analysis at the moment, as you can imagine. We've got evidence of some young, fit, healthy people, but not so healthy that they didn't die, obviously, but we've got evidence for some have been quite ill with kind of dietary deficiencies. We've got one person with a massive chunk knocked out the back of their head with something sharp. We are slowly working on the usual range of analyses and starting to look at doing things like isotopic analysis, which can tell us about where people may have come from and what their diet is. The take home is we've got a long-lived cemetery with lots of very dense intercutting. Also, we've been finding these are fragments of what are called name stones. These are fairly small little bits of carving. They're about the size of, well, they range from a hefty paperback book to an A4 file pad, as it were. You can see from the hands holding them. And these are small burial markers. These round-headed examples are more or less unique to Lindisfarne. And they're very simple little things. The ones we've got are quite fragmentary because the top layers of our site have been quite badly knocked around by later medieval ploughing. They don't look very flash, but you've got to remember they probably would have been painted. And here's some photographs of some of the other ones from the island found in previous kind of grave digging and things, and you get a sense of what they look like. They're little crosses with names written on, the names of the dead. Quite a few of them have these little sunk either central bosses or end bosses to the cross, which probably would have seated either a glass or metal roundel. So they would have been quite elaborate, decorated, multicolored things. Not big, but very nice looking. And you can see with the kind of cross layout, they're very similar to things like some of those carpet pages, the elaborate decorated pages in things like the Lindisfarne Gospels. So there's a kind of dialogue going on between the sculpture and the manuscript, illuminated manuscript traditions we have coming out of the island. But we also found other bits of sculpture. We found this on our very first season. It doesn't look much, but it's actually my favourite piece. What we've got is a central stem, which we interpreted as the stem of a cross, with two cross slits either side. The reason why I like this is because there are no parallels to this from anywhere in the corpus of Anglo-Saxon sculpture in Northumberland or County Durham, so not from the Northumbrian heartlands. And we have Durham, we have the corpus of Anglo-Saxon sculptures. We've got a huge amount of comparative data to look at, but we can find parallels. And what made finding parallels easier is that 2 years later, we found the top bits about 2 meters away, and you can see we've got the top bit, and it's because of the light, you can't see the little side crosses quite so well, but we were right that our interpretation of a cross is correct, and we've got that kind of cusp-shaped cross, which some of you may recognise from the cross found in the grave of St Cuthbert, a very distinctive Cuthbertine-shaped cross. So where do we find parallels for things like this? Well, this is the most obvious one, the so-called Golgotha stone from Whithorn, very similar in size as well. And Whithorn in Dumfries and Galloway is a Northumbrian ecclesiastical site, and other places where we find this kind of set of three crosses there's other examples from Western Scotland and also from Ireland. So there's this kind of, although Lindisfarne is a Northumbrian monastery, it's got these hints of sculptural connections with southwestern Scotland, Western Scotland, and even into Ireland as well. So it's nice. What we found here, whilst not very fancy, not very impressive in one sense, is actually in its own quiet, subdued way a really interesting link with the wider Northumbrian church. Here's our other trench, the other side of the bulk, and again you can see some interesting things going on. First of all, yes, there are lots of burials, and as we work this area down, we're finding continued distribution of human remains, and again we found some more fragments of the Anglo-Saxon cross namestones. But what we're more interested in at the moment is what's going on in this area here. Now, in our first 2 seasons, we had what we're fairly happy was the base of a simple building. You can just about still see hints of it here, though we've excavated a lot of it away. We've got lines of post pads roughly along there, and then there's a turn up there. There was a gully, which you can't really see on this photo because it's kind of eroded out a bit, but it was nothing very fancy, but it would have been the stone foundations or the stone bases of a timber superstructure. And there's really good parallels to these from sites like the Anglo-Saxon monastery at Hartlepool, the Northumbrian monastery at Hoddom in southwest Scotland. So that was a good building. But we started to find, I'm going to home in here, as we explored this area, we had a big area of burning and this kind of strange cross wall feature here. As we started investigating it, we're starting to get some really interesting features coming out. We've got this where it's labelled number 4. This is filled with what looks like lime or plasterwork or something. It's this big wodge of kind of concreted lime material. And then we've got this feature here. We found the edge of it first, and we thought it was a small hearth in the building. But as we excavated, we realised it actually underlay the building. And actually what we've got is the edge of a big feature running around like this. And this photo doesn't show it fully excavated because we're still working on it, but the edge actually carries on around there, and around there. So what we've got is a great big sunken area We've moved a lot more of the rubble now. I didn't have an up-to-date photo, unfortunately, accessible today. Big sunken area with lots of in situ burning. All this edge is actually clearly burnt in situ, lying beneath the later building. So first of all, we've got stratigraphy, we've got layers, which is great because that'll help us unpick the chronology as we move forward. And what we think we've got, and this is just to give you a sense of the shape, and it's clearly continuing under our trench edges, is an area of metalworking. Because over our excavation, we found lots of slags, metalworking debris coming out of that area. Now, some of the slag is smithing slag for ironworking, so nothing very fancy, but we've got hints of iron smelting, which is a bit more uncommon. We've also got quite a lot of evidence for non-ferrous metalworking, so copper alloy, bronze working. We've got a copper alloy ingot, we've got fragments and spills of where people have been moving around molten bronze, which is sloshed and left driblets and droplets everywhere. We're still, again, we're mid-analysis at the moment, but we've got bits of furnace lining and a ceramic vessel that could well be a crucible. We've got some undiagnostic slags. So basically, we've got a really interesting area of metalworking, and of course, Monastery is precisely the kind of place we'd expect to find metalworking. If you could, this slightly blurry picture on the left is from the Franks casket, an 8th century whalebone carved box from Northumbria, which almost more or less exactly probably the same date as our metalworking area. There's a nice depiction here of Wayland the smith with his forge and his anvil doing metalworking. There's also an almost exactly contemporary metalworking site, very similar to ours, just over the water at Bamborough. So we've still got a lot more excavation to do, and what we're hoping to find in future are things like mould fragments to actually see what objects they might have been casting. But we're still very much at the beginning of the story on that front. We're also getting lots of increasing quantities of faunal remains. As you'll have seen from the pictures of the graves, we've got really good bone preservation, which is quite unusual in Northumbria, really. So to actually have fully preserved human remains and animal bone is fantastic. I did dig a Roman cemetery in County Durham a couple of years ago, where basically all we had was maybe a handful of teeth if we were lucky, because the soil was so acid. So we're very lucky we got good preservation. And what kind of things have we got? Well, we've got the usual range of animals one might expect. We've got kind of equids, so horse, donkeys, that kind of thing. Cows. Now, Bede writes how Lindisfarne was wealthy in cattle, but not in gold. And of course, one would expect cattle because you would need calves to make parchment for manuscript production. We've got deer. We've got pig, sheep, goat, dog, all these various things. And the birds, what's interesting is, as well as the geese and the chickens and the normal things, we have seabirds, which is perhaps not surprising, but quite an important reminder that the monks were exploiting those maritime resources where they are. So you've got puffin bone, you've got gull bone, you've got guillemot bone. There's no puffins on the island today, but there are puffins on Inner Farne. So it's quite possible they're going out to Inner Farne, where the monastery had a hermitage and may have been hunting wildfowl over there. And many of you will know that even today things like puffin and gannet are eaten in the North Atlantic. So puffin hunting in Iceland and in the Outer Hebrides, there's still a salted gannet, guga, is still a delicacy. We've also getting maritime remains as well, which is really interesting, because the traditional story in archaeology is that we have something called the 10th century fish horizon, when suddenly everybody starts doing deep sea fishing. But what's clear is from our monastic site, there are features which are probably 8th, 9th century, but they're already quite clearly heavily exploiting maritime resources. So you've got a range of different fish. You've got cod. Some of those cod are quite big, which means they're probably coming in from quite far out in the North Sea. They're clearly not just fishing the immediate coastal waters. They have got a range of other fish from all sorts of kind of ecological niches. They also like their seafood. So there's oysters, periwinkles, whelks. Yeah, they're really kind of making the most of those those extensive tidal flats, which are a really important part of the landscape today. And of course, Bede, when he's writing the preface of his ecclesiastical history, he writes about the importance of maritime resources. He talks Britain and Ireland and the Atlantic, the greatest plenty of salmon and eels, seals, dolphins and whales. So clearly, these Northumbrian monks, they are making the most of what's kind of literally and metaphorically at their doorstep. Now, Bede mentioned seal, and we are also getting seal bone. Seals, anyone who's been to the island will know that there are still really extensive seal colonies on the sandbanks and out at the inner Farne Islands. And I mean, seals are basically kind of massive, angry lumps of calorie, basically. They're big, fat, grumpy lumps of blubber. So they probably didn't taste very nice, but they would have been really important for the blubber, for oil lamps, that kind of thing. And we know from various early medieval sources which suggest that seal hide was being used for things like ship's ropes. I went down a splendid wormhole on one of the things that just occurred to me is I started wondering, how do you render down a seal when you don't have any, we didn't have any pots, any ceramics, and we don't have any evidence for metal cauldrons. And I went down this amazing wormhole on YouTube of Inuit cooking videos. So if you've got a strong stomach, it's worth having a look at that. And you realize that you don't need, if a seal will self-render if left in a wooden bucket long enough. So that's something, apart from anything, gives you a sense of what these Anglo-Saxon monasteries must have smelt like. The Life of St. Columba gives us this lovely little vignette about the seals there, where the monks clearly had proprietorial rights over the seals in the surrounding areas. So it's seals clearly important parts of life on the island. We're also starting to get whale as well. We had a big chunk of whale bone from the later medieval stuff we excavated in the first year, but 2 years ago we got this, which is the squamous bone. So it's the back of the skull of a whale. We think it's killer whale at the moment. Unfortunately, because of COVID, we can't get into the reference collections. But we know that the Anglo-Saxons were exploiting whale. They probably weren't hunting them. They're probably making the most of the ones which got beached. And on the Frank's casket I showed you an image of earlier on, you've got this lovely quote, because it's made from whale bone, and there's this inscription on the Frank's casket which reads, "The flood cast up the fish on the mountain cliff. The Terror King became sad when he swam on the shingle, whale's bone." So there's a little haiku-like reference about where the bone of the casket came from. It came from a beached whale. So that's another really interesting aspect of the life of that maritime aspect of the monastery, and given the extent to which cetaceans would have been much more popular, much more of them in the waters back then, beaching probably wouldn't have been that uncommon. Other things we found, this is a lovely little piece from a couple of years ago, a medieval glass gaming piece, tiny thing, about 1 centimetre high, but very finely produced out of glass. It's actually blue glass coloured with cobalt, and you can see from the bottom, actually this thing here is a bit of corroded iron. There's obviously an iron peg in the middle, and at some point someone's tried to re-drill a second hole there, and there's good parallels to this from other sites. This is I might have to begrudgingly admit, it's a slightly nicer one from Dundurn, short up near Perth. There's other parallels to these from Dorset, big European trading site in the Netherlands, and these are from a game, well, games called Tafel games or table games, of which some of you may have heard of the Viking Nefertafel. These are part of a kind of shared elite lifestyle across the North Sea, so played by rich traders. They're sometimes found in burials as grave goods, and it shows that Lindisfarne is kind of plugged in to this wider trading world and world of a kind of shared elite trading and Christian culture, which extends up into Pictland and over to places like Frisia. So it's actually quite important to remind that the life in the monastery wasn't necessarily terribly austere all the time. Let's not forget that one of the kings of Northumbria retires to Lindisfarne, and when he does so, he gives them sanctions their permission to drink wine. So the monks were clearly quite able to drink wine, play nice board games. It wasn't all kind of misery and puffins. And we find these kind of fragments of board games from other early medieval sites. So there's a fragment from the early medieval playing board from Inchmarnock, and a playing board from Port Mahomack. So we've got this evidence there. These are the kind of thing monks are doing. And I think it puts a lovely kind of human dimension to what life would have been like on the island. Generally speaking, we're relatively low on finds, but we find small quantities of other material. We've got this spindle whorl, we've got a dress pin, we've got other fragments of bits and pieces we're currently analysing at the moment, and also getting increasing quantities of Anglo-Saxon coinage as well. Particularly, we've got about 10 coins now of Ethelred II, who's a very, very minor Northumbrian king, but they're all from around the metalworking area, and I'm wondering whether actually these things were being melted down for their metal worth and being used for their value as copper alloy. And also as a reminder that Lindisfarne would have been, in a world without towns, Lindisfarne would have probably been the biggest population centre, certainly north of a Tyne, probably north of a Tees, to be honest, and it probably would have been acting as a centre for trade and exchange. I'm not saying the monastery was a town, but in some ways it acted as a town. Right. Finally, as I said, we're only halfway through. We've done 5 years. We're planning another 5 years of work. Still got a lot of questions. We still need to understand that craft and industry better. I want to understand that metalworking particularly, and we need to really think about refining down the chronologies. In the absence of many datable artifacts, we need to start using carbon-14 dating and those kind of techniques to try and tie up our chronology a bit more tightly. We've got a lot of laboratory work to do on the burial population. Who are the dead of Lindisfarne? Are these people from the island themselves? Are they people from elsewhere in Northumbria or even further? We wouldn't be surprised to find pilgrims coming from elsewhere in Anglo-Saxon England, or from Scotland, or from Ireland, or even the continent. And we're also starting now to unpick the landscape as well. We've got a new PhD student working on the early medieval landscape from a geoarchaeological approach. There's other sites on the island. There's at least one bit of early medieval metalwork from where the castle now is on the island. There's the St Cuthbert's Island, the little tidal island just off the main island of Lindisfarne. So there's a lot to do, and fingers crossed, all things going equally, we hope to be back on the island in September. So light a candle and say a prayer to St Cuthbert, and hopefully we'll be there to carry on unpicking what we're finding. So I'll leave it there.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, David. I'll let you take a slug of water.
Here's water, yeah.
Well, that was a really interesting talk on, what's obviously a really important and ongoing excavation. So we're very privileged to get a sneak preview. I'm not going to ask any questions. I'll hand over to Rob, who's been handling the questions that have been coming in on the chat box, and Rob will ask you personally the questions we've received.
Excellent.
Hi, David. Right, so got a couple of questions in the chat box. The first one is, has erosion changed the shape of the peninsula?
It's a good question. I mean, it's impossible to know how much erosion there's been. We don't think there's been significant amounts. Most of the island is rock. The kind of western end is more sandy, but the main kind of eastern block of the island is limestone and sandstone. And whilst there's been perhaps maybe a little bit of erosion on the side facing out to the North Sea, the side facing towards the Sound, towards the mainland, yeah, there's small scale erosion, but nothing substantial as far as we know.
Okay, and a question from Sally is concerning one of the slide about the cloister early on. Could the second cloister have been an infirmary cloister?
Yeah, absolutely. That's our current interpretation. I mean, we put a very, very small trench across it just to confirm that it was what it was. I do have minor queries about whether it was actually entirely ever built, whether we just got something which has been laid out. One of the features of this area, of course, it's an area where you get a lot of Scottish raiding in the medieval period, and I just wonder whether where you look, where it would have kind of classed the main monastery, there's now some really substantial walls, and either it was laid out and never fully built, or it was laid out and then contracted in to make the monastery more defensive. But yeah, it does embrace the infirmary, or what's believed to be the infirmary. So I think an infirmary cloister is the most likely interpretation. Yeah.
Fantastic. Did you find a charnel house for the displaced bodies?
No, we didn't find anything structural, though we do have our very big odd wall, so that's something we still need to unpick. We've got some other little hints of masonry there. Nothing distinctively charnel-y. I mean, we had a lot of charnel, but that's basically because the top layers of our cemetery were ploughed up in the medieval period. There's actually ridge and furrow in that field, but yeah, it'd be nice to see something more structural in that cemetery of that type, a mortuary chapel or something, but not yet. Fingers crossed.
Okay. Have you found any evidence of earlier occupation before the monks arrived in 635?
Right, we haven't, not on our excavation. There is a little bit earlier from the island. If you go back to the early prehistory, there's certainly Mesolithic site on the north side of the island. There's a Neolithic hand axe found in a secondary context in the village. There's a tiny bit of Bronze Age metalwork. There's a couple of Roman coins and a tiny bit of Roman pottery, but it's all very bitty and nothing really in context. When we did our geophysical survey, we've got one thing which could be an Iron Age enclosure, but it could be an awful lot of other things as well. But I'd be very, very surprised there wasn't activity on the island, before the Anglo-Saxons turn up.
Just a couple more. One is, why do you think Holy Island has been relatively neglected by archaeologists until recent?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think it kind of goes, it's kind of to do partly with the institutional way in which archaeology is developed in terms of where the universities are. Durham has always been the biggest archaeology department in the northeast. I mean, obviously Newcastle's got a fantastic and really important archaeology department, but for a long time they didn't really work on early medieval stuff. Durham was the centre for the early medieval study. So, I mean, the brilliant work of Rosemary Cramp, but she dug Monk Wearmouth and Jarrow, and I think that's that's enough for anybody. I think that's kept her busy for a very, very long time. So I think she didn't extend that far north. The other big kind of northern centre for early medieval studies has really been Glasgow, with people like Leslie Alcock going back into the past, and they're the ones who are very closely involved with places like Iona. So kind of Lindisfarne was just slightly out, just too far north or too far east, depending whether you're in Glasgow or Durham. So just the way things are. I mean, Brian Hope Taylor, who dug Yevering, did do a little bit of work in Lindisfarne, but he lost his mojo. It wasn't his finest hour. It wasn't great archaeology, and he never published it. But there's a really big project by Leicester, which is fantastic stuff, but they mainly looked at a really interesting early medieval site on the north side of the island, and they didn't really explore the monastic area so much.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more question, and it might be the biggest question. What did a program of saint making look like in Cuthbert's time?
I think if you've got a saint, you need a series of things you need to do. You need to have a focus for him. So that's his body. You got a saint needs relics. So normally, in most cases, this is literally the lifting out of the body, out of the ground, into a shrine above ground. And Bede talks quite nicely about how that happened with Cuthbert. And so his body is taken out of the grave. He's probably dressed with, we know there's silk there. He has his comb and the famous Cuthbert cross. He's placed in the wooden thing above ground, which becomes the focus for devotion. You also need ideally, you need a saint's life, you need a vita, a written work talking about, giving the biography, explaining why he's important. And Cuthbert's spoilt because he's got three. He's got an anonymous life, a prose life by Bede, and a metrical rhyming life, rhythmic life, also written by Bede. So that helps spread his cult, because you can, once you've got the hagiography, you can pass it round to people. You need a building in which to have the relics, so you need churches. And my feeling is that laying out of those churches and an alignment, I think that was part of that saint making process, because that's a really clear allusion to kind of a Roman Frankish tradition of church laying out. I can't see that happening before Cuthbert, and I think that would have been part of that elaboration and building the stone church around him. You also need just kind of a variety of other things which can be connected with people like Bede. So again, I think it's the gospel book which dates the dates about right, as far as we can tell, but obviously it's stylistic dating rather than absolute dating. But that seems to fit in at the same period when we're having this great push to promote Cuthbert as the patron saint of Northumbria. So the creation of a big gospel book like that thing which would have been on the altar, it would have been open, it would have been visible to visitors. It's not something which would only been taken out. It's not really to be read, it's really to be displayed. It's a display book. So these are all things which are part of that process of kind of framing Cuthbert in terms of what he did, his miracles, his stories, the infrastructure for pilgrimage. There's lots of things going on around the making of a cult.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all for your questions, and now I'll hand back to Hugh to round us up.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. I mean, there's so much to unpack there, but we could go on all night. I just really like to thank David for sharing his, unpublished results with us. It's amazing to get this insight into what's going on. I've really enjoyed it. I had lots of questions, but I wasn't going to ask them. But no, that was a fantastic overview of what's a really, really important research project going on in this country at the moment. And COVID aside, there's not so many of them at this present time, in this time period, let's put it that way. So it's really exciting to see these results. I'd like to thank you all for turning up, asking exciting questions. As I can see, the chat feed is still going up, telling us where you're all from. That's really good too, to see we've got people all around the world joining in right now. And that's one of the beauties of Zoom. So this is something that we as the Society for Church Archaeology are going to carry on doing. We would like your support. We're going to be putting on more lectures. We want you to join us, both for the lectures, but perhaps if you want to join the society as well, that would be welcome. But our mission is to foster the research into the archaeology of the church in its broadest sense, so it's not confined in any definition. But I won't blather on any longer. Just to say thank you very much for turning up. Thank you exceptionally very much for our speaker, who has given us an excellent talk. And I hope to see you next month. And this is the bit where I'm totally ill prepared because I can't remember who our next speaker is. And I'm prompting to Rob to tell me.
Dr. John Jenkins from the University of
Jonathan Jenkins. Watch our feed, and we'll have another exciting lecture in a month's time. So thank you very much for turning up, and we will hopefully see you all soon.
I just think I've seen my old headmaster.